contact information, etc. Okay,
Right.
we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Walter Herbst, and he's written just an excellent two-part series about what led up to the assassination of JFK. And we talked earlier about Volume 1, and both titles are the same, Volume 1 and 2. Volume 1 is It Did Not Start with JFK, the decades of events that led to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And this will be Volume 2. So I would recommend people go back and listen to the earlier conversation we had about JFK. But there's so much information here. I just keep learning so much reading through his book, so I'm delighted to have him back. So Walter Herbst, welcome back to William Ramsey Investigates.
Well, thanks very much, William. It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard our earlier discussion, maybe you can just do a little background and lead up through what was in Volume 1, maybe an overview, and then lead into this second volume.
Sure. So It Did Not Start with JFK is basically an analysis of the 20th century from 1920s up to 1960, demonstrating how there were fake news, what we call it today, but lies or misrepresentation of facts and manipulation and sabotage of what presidents wanted to do in order to maintain a containment of communism more than anything else. And so that's what Volume 1 was mostly about. It took us up to World War II. It started with 1920s with things like eugenics, assassination attempts against FDR, an alliance, or at least a relationship between certain elements in the United States, the elites and the Nazis, up through World War II and the Korean War. And that's basically where we left off at Volume 1. Now, Volume 2 starts from there, and it basically starts with the rise of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, that began pretty much after the Korean War, to ensure that this money-making industry was not destroyed. And it goes through the Eisenhower years and focuses a lot, Volume 2 does, on the war against Cuba, and Oswald and his basically from when he was a teenager. And he's an amazing character. If you take the assassination out of the equation, I mean, he's 23, I think, when he gets when he dies, and from the minute he's a teenager, going to New York, going to New Orleans, going to Atsugi, Japan in the Marines, coming back to California in the Marines, defecting to the Soviet Union, there's this like intelligence connection hovering all over him that you just can't ignore. And and that's essentially what Volume 2 is about.
Right, and it is incredible. Like his life, he had the most curious life for somebody who died at the age of 24. So he was in. Can you talk about the beginnings? So some people don't know the bouncing story of where he was, and they just heard he was a Marine who defected to Russia or something like that. But there's a lot more to that story, right?
Oh, it's an amazing story. So he's a young man. He's living just him and his mother. He has an older brother and a stepbrother. And the mother just decides to take him and move to New York because that's where the stepbrother, John Pick, is living. So he's in New York and he's basically unhappy there. He is a truant, and he gets arrested for that. And later on, his address book has addresses in the New York area of neo-Nazis in the United States and things like that. But that's no one knows whether he wrote them at that time or later on. But so anyways, he goes to court on the truancy charge, and it's basically a simple thing. And his truant officer looks at his file, and his report basically says that, you know what, here's a guy, he's grown up with an overbearing mother, no father, and he's just a little confused. That's essentially what the report is. But he winds up, there's this Dr. Hertog who winds up putting him into an institution to be examined. And he even talks about taking him to seminars and things. Now, there's something about Oswald in this institution at the time that
Yeah, it's
is just
Bordentown, I think is what you
well,
call it.
he's not in Bordentown, but Bordentown Reformatory in New Jersey is associated with this institution that he's in New York. And the thing about Bordentown is that is where they conducted mind-altering drug experimentation on innocent people. They love to do it on kids in those type of places, on felons or what have you, people who, if something went wrong, you could easily just sweep them under the rug, right? So was Oswald subject to mind control experiments like LSD and what have you? There's no hard facts of that, but we do know that George Hunter White, who seemed to cross paths with Oswald on occasion, and people that Oswald knew, he was working out of Bordentown. Oswald, as we go forward.
Just to interrupt, George
Sure.
White is a very important figure in the CIA. He came right out of the war and was one of the early trainees into the CIA. He's not a small figure, and he's notorious for running Operation Midnight Climax, which was in San Francisco and New York in the Haight, I think, where they were drugging.
That's right.
Yeah, prostitutes drugging people. So this is somebody who he drank like a full fifth of scotch a day and was very much involved in MK Ultra sub-projects, doing drug implementation on unwitting subjects. So sorry.
No, that's fine. But just to just touch base on this man again. So he's in the OSS during World War II, which is the precursor to the CIA, right? The U.S. intelligence during World War II, and he is training some of the leaders who would later on be the leaders of the CIA, like the Angletons and the Tracy Barneses and what have you, and all of these people. Okay,
he came up with the former future head of the CIA, the guy who ended up suspiciously dying in a lake. So he was friends with all of them.
Yeah, Colby, right?
Colby,
right.
Yeah, Colby. Thanks.
Yeah. So I mean, the guy. The one thing about you study this, the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassination of JFK, and there is this serendipity, or there's this pieces that come together that have no explanation. Like when George Hunter White, he joined the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was lent to the CIA, and had a safe house like you described, had one in New York, one in San Francisco, and also Las Vegas, where he's drugging unsuspected people, mostly mobsters, and he's investigating mobsters. Now, while he's doing this, there is this mysterious death in a federal agent down in Texas, Houston, and the informant for this guy and who he went to see was Rose Sheremy. Now, that's a name you may be familiar with. In 1963, on a couple of months before JFK gets assassinated, she gets thrown out of a car in Louisiana and gets picked up. She's an LSD drug addict. She says we're on our way to pick. There was this ship coming in and pick up some drugs, and we were going to assassinate JFK.
I think that's how Stone starts off the JFK movie.
Exactly, that is exactly correct. But now, how does George Hunter White, who gets associated or mixed up with all this other stuff, wind up with this woman years before in the 1950s in Houston? And next thing you know, she's getting thrown out of a car like Stone shows, and then everything and then she talks about Oswald and Ruby, and as if she knows them, and said, "Oh, they're both gay," and but facts that she had to have some knowledge of the men to make such a statement, and so anyway, so getting back to what we had started, George Hunter White, yeah, he's a key figure, and so he then is involved with his Bordentown reformatory, but Oswald leaves there. And the interesting thing about how he departed then, so he comes out and his mother keeps getting threatened that they're going to throw him back in for whatever reason, right? So she just grabs him and heads to New Orleans. And she's from New Orleans. They had family in New Orleans. So she settles in there, and Oswald goes into school, but he keeps dropping out of school, and he winds up with David Ferry. Now, David Ferry is at the time he was an ex-pilot. He was an Eastern Airlines pilot. Winds up losing his pilot's license because he had a propensity to fool around with young boys sexually, and that was pretty much common knowledge. The INS was keeping an eye on him because he was actually taking some of these kids and flying to other countries, and so Oswald's mixed up with this man that he shouldn't be involved with, and it's possible because Ferry was also accused of he was an amateur hypnotist, so he is hypnotizing some of these kids and stuff's going on, and Oswald's in the middle of it, and it's possible that he already gets involved with Guy Bannister through Ferry at this point. Now we know that Oswald and Bannister get together in the summer of 1963. Bannister was an ultra right winger, racist, who was planting young men in various places like Tulane University, and who would act like they were pro-communist to see if they could draw out students or individuals who were pro-communist, right? So because the feeling at the time was that Russia, the Communist Party USA, was funding the communist groups over here, were funding civil rights groups. And so by this point, it's past 1950.
Right. And Bannister is a very, like you said, hard right racist, but also networked within the Louisiana political system. So he knows Leander Perez, Senator James Eastland. So he's in a kind of network of the hard right, right?
100%. These are people, I mean, who were their way of life was at stake. The Southern way of life. 1954, you had Little Rock, Arkansas,
Brown
and
v.
the
Board of Education,
desegregation of schools. And these people knew it was coming, say, to Texas and to Louisiana. They didn't like it. And they were going to do whatever they could to stop it. In fact, I think it was Leander Perez, who was a Catholic, who was then excommunicated from the church because of he took it to such an extent. So anyway, Bannister, you're right, is in the middle of it, and he's not looked at like some kind of a crazy nut. I mean, he's an ex-FBI agent from Chicago who headed an office that was the second largest FBI office in the country. He goes and he's I can't remember if he was chief of police in Louisiana, in New Orleans, but he was up there, and he winds up getting thrown out for whatever reasons, and he starts his own detective agency, and he is considered an expert, and it testifies in front of Congress, in front of Louisiana, Mississippi, you name it, on behalf of the subversiveness, in their opinion, of the connection between the civil rights movement and the Communist Party. And this is at the time McCarthy is doing his thing, right? So,
and I think you had a quote about him. It said, "Communism is the cause of racial unrest in America."
Yeah,
so there's a connection between. And one more thing, Bannister travels to Arkansas, and the title of his speech, get this: "Unrest blamed on Reds." There were two different ones. Unrest blamed on Reds, and the other one was half of commie trained Americans were of the Negro race. Those were the titles of his talks in Arkansas.
Right now, to us, it's ridiculous looking back, but you have to place yourself in the mid 1950s. These people really believed this, right? They really thought that the Communist Party was trying to they didn't understand that black people on their own wanted to change the situation they were living under. That Jim Crow and what have you, the time had come to get rid of these things. No, there were outside influences that were forcing them, or at least goading them to go in that direction. So Oswald winds up in the middle of this, and we don't know if at that point he actually met Bannister, but it's very possible because of the Ferry-Bannister relationship. What we do know is that just like they left New York, his mother just took him, and out of the blue just goes to Fort Worth, Texas, and just bugs out for quickly for apparently no reason.
But he's very young at this time, 15, 16, right? So maybe the mid 50s. And you actually kind of asked the question, did Ferry have a sexual relationship with Oswald? if Ferry is raping these other kids, other boys, maybe Oswald was just another of his targets, which I think would be an important part of the story.
Right. Now, there's two things about Ferry. Now, these are, call it circumstantial or what have you, but he applied when he was in Fort Worth, and he applied for trying to get into the Marines a year early, couldn't do it. But a recruiting officer came into his home, which is a little unusual. People speculate was that Ferry. But when he was in Russia and his wife was going to have a baby, expecting a baby, if the child was going to be a boy, Oswald wanted the boy named David. Now, that doesn't mean David Ferry, but there's no relative in Oswald's family background or whatever whose name is David. The only person he knew that had any influence was David Ferry. Now, maybe it's a stretch, but it's just another box you check off of circumstantial evidence that something not right was happening, and his mother maybe was well advised to just take him and get out of New Orleans.
Right. So she's constantly moving him. It's really strange. And Ferry is a strange character, right? He has no hair on his body.
Right.
He is a hardcore neo-Nazi. I think you wrote in the book,
right,
like he wanted to create a Fourth Reich or something, like, in just total in associating with neo. So the fact that the neo-Nazis and the Klan, they really were around at that time and around these characters, right?
100%. And it kind of made sense because what these people believed in was similar to what the Nazis believed in. And so, I mean, anti-communist, anti-Jewish, just totalitarian, against, say, New Deal, or any kind of social programs. They had their own idea of the direction they want the country to go in. They thought, starting at FDR, Truman, even Eisenhower, Kennedy, they thought they were all communist presidents. And there was no talking with them. And Ferry once gave a speech, this would be before the Bay of Pigs, and he said, nothing would make me happier to just go and just shoot and blow up every communist that there was. I mean, he was too right for some right wingers, but he was CIA connected. Okay, and as was, it appears, Bannister, right? So and Clay Shaw, that whole element, that group in New Orleans had CIA connections. And Oswald, yeah, so Oswald gets kind of sucked into the middle of it, and so he eventually does join the Marines, right? He's in Fort Worth. He's old enough. His older brother was in the Marines. He joins the Marines, and he goes to Atsugi, Japan. Now, he's not there very long, and immediately he becomes a radar operator of the U-2 flights that would eventually be those spy planes, right? That would travel over the Soviet Union mostly, and could from 75,000 feet take camera photographs of installations on the ground, and it was the only way the United States could determine what the capacity of the Soviet Union was as far as nuclear missiles and weapons and what have you. So it was important, and Oswald was in the middle of it. So he's not there very long, and he shoots himself in the arm. Superficial wound, but he had ordered a pistol, mail order from the United States. And it was a minor wound. In fact, when he shot himself, he looked at it and he said, "Yeah, I think I shot myself." Well, he winds up spending 19 days in the brig. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Oswald was already being pointed in the direction of some kind of intelligence operation, and that he was being, at this point, perhaps for the first time, but mind-altering drugs, and it's pretty convincing that he was. Okay, and then there's a husband and wife named the Wilcotts who, after the assassination, came forward and said that they were CIA stationed in Japan, and that they had evidence that Oswald was already a CIA involved in a CIA operation. Now, here's what we know about behind the scenes of what Oswald was doing. He winds up going to a club called the Queen Bee that was tailored mostly for or suitable for officers who made more than Oswald did. He was a grunt private, right? And he had no money. And he winds up meeting this woman at the Queen Bee who is she a prostitute, whatever she is, but she gets shows an interest in Oswald, which he never would have done. So that right away raised a red flag. So Oswald says that he went back, told authorities, what have you. Now, he may have been subjected to a lie detector test at this point, and maybe there was some question about his loyalty, what he was doing. But simultaneously with this, he winds up at the Soviet embassy in Japan. And there's this Colonel Arashkin that he sees. And there's really no explanation for why they would even want to see a guy like Oswald. But what makes things or adds to the murkiness of everything is there's a CIA agent that's well known to everyone who's investigated this. His name is Richard Case Nagel, and he was a member of a secretive OFI, this military group / an assassination group, what have you. And he says he accidentally ran into Oswald at outside the embassy. Okay, which just seems a little bit far-fetched, right? So, especially since he winds up with Oswald again in 1963, gets told to basically keep an eye on him, tail him. For people who don't know, in September 1963, 2 months before the assassination, Nagel walked into a bank in El Paso, shot a pistol into the air, went out, sat down, and waited to get arrested. And basically, he said it was to extricate himself from a situation that he had no way of getting out of. He knew the assassination was coming. After the assassination, the FBI spent 2 hours interviewing Marina Oswald, Lee Oswald's wife, about Richard Case Nagel. So this Richard Case Nagel just happens to show up at Atsugi, outside, and just accidentally run into Oswald. Most likely, he was told to keep an eye on Oswald.
And he wasn't the only one. There are all these minders around Oswald, which
Constantly.
makes even the whole story creepier. Right?
Yeah, it does.
Even
right?
Ferry. Yeah.
And Ferry, right? Ferry, when he was Ferry, it's amazing that Ferry runs into Oswald in 1954. He runs into him again in 63 when Oswald comes back. In the middle of it, while Oswald has defected to the Soviet Union, there is a group that approaches a car dealership in New Orleans, Bolton car dealership, and they're looking to buy some trucks, basically for the war to ship to Cuba. At the time, for the anti-Castro Cuban exiles fighting Castro. Well, the name that they say to put on who's handling the financing is Oswald. And so he's a relatively unknown. It's been 5 years since Ferry had known him in New Orleans, but the name Oswald is there. So maybe it's a different Oswald, right? But a couple of weeks later, the FBI goes and they visit the Fort Worth Merchants Association to see if there's any link with Oswald or anything like that. So they've already connected a possible Lee Harvey Oswald connection to all of this. But Oswald at this point in the Soviet Union, right? So, I mean, how is it that a man that is supposedly unknown, I can tell you my life today, I don't know about you, but especially when I was 23, no one was interested in anything I was doing.
Me either.
Right. So here's this nobody, right? So he's in Atsugi. He gets thrown in the brig. He's horsing around with this Queen Bee hostess. He's with this guy Arashkin. He then gets out of the brig, punches out a sergeant, goes back into the brig again. He winds up going to the Philippines with his group. Breaks down crying when he is on guard duty, can't take it anymore. They hustle him on a plane, send him back to Japan, say that he was suffering from a form of venereal disease. winds up in the under observation again. He's always seemed to be like, if you had someone who was being tested for mind-altering drugs, Oswald, they're looking over him like with kid gloves, and they're putting him on mess duty when he was a radar operator and all of that. So another man goes back to El Toro base in California. He shows up there, and all of a sudden he's pro-Russian. He's taking courses and studying Russian. He tells people, call me Oswaldovich. He says when I'm he's playing, he loves to play chess. He plays chess with people. He wants the Red Army, red pieces, because the Red Army is always victorious. Nonsense like this, and somehow that goes overlooked. Nobody cares. Okay, so he winds up then going to this Unitarian church, and it looks like Curry Thornley is the one who takes him there, fellow Marine. Now Thornley is an interesting character in his own right. He after the assassination, he's the only one at El Toro who says that Oswald was a communist. Everyone else says no, he wasn't.
Wow.
Right? Wow. I mean, and now Thornley then winds up with Oswald. He may have known him in 1954 already in New Orleans, because he came out and said, the way he talked in front of the Warren Commission, that he knew him on a number of occasions. But in 1963, Thornley and Oswald are together. Okay, people call them the Bobbsey twins. They're dressing all in black together. They're doing, right? So, I mean, and Thornley winds up going to Atsugi after the fact, and after Oswald defects, and he actually, believe it or not, writes a book about Oswald after he defects to the Soviet Union. This would be long before the assassination. Wow. So what does he know? And after the assassination, he's being investigated very carefully by authorities. And he says something to the effect that before it's all, it was fun while they were investigating. Maybe before it's all over, I'll go pee on JFK's grave. And so anyway, but he takes him to this Unitarian church. And what makes that so important is, number one, they had an association with the Albert Schweitzer College in Switzerland, which Oswald applied to. Now, no one in the United States, or very few people, knew of the Albert Schweitzer College. How does Oswald, this is right, obviously pre-internet, pre-cable TV, pre-everything, right. A guy, some grunt who was in Japan, now he's in California, applies to this very liberal Albert Schweitzer College. Well, the approval for his application goes through Unitarian Church in Rhode Island, their main office, to get over to Albert Schweitzer, where he gets accepted. Okay, and then when you dig further, you find out that the Unitarian Church actually has a World War II relationship with the United States intelligence, where they're in Europe and they're involved with bringing emigres back over to the United States and things like that. So there's a strong connection. Meanwhile, there's a far left element of that group as well, with Stephen Fritschman, who is the pastor there, who's investigated by the U.S. government for his communist leanings. So anyway, so
but isn't the, sorry to interrupt, but isn't the Unitarian Church, it claims to be a Christian church, but it's almost like the perennial philosophy, New Age. The Unitarians aren't orthodox, I think, and I think it attracts maybe, I don't know, I wouldn't put it on the conservative liberal spectrum. I'd say that they integrate a lot of different global wisdom, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and they're very leftist too. At least elements. They attract leftist people who are pro-Castro before Castro comes to power. And so the Oswald gets dragged into this group, and I don't think they had an influence on him at all. But I think they were somehow involved in the man's defection to the Soviet Union, because he then applies to go to defect. And just one other thing, for the rest of Oswald's life, he seems to be shadowed by Unitarian Church members. You've got Thornley, who, as I already mentioned, sees him a couple of times. Now, his babysitter, or he and Marina's, more so Marina's, was Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne and Michael Payne are Quakers / turned Unitarians when they had Oswald in Dallas. Now, George de Morenscheit is a name that everyone knows. Oswald's little babysitter, but this wealthy oil-related aristocrat becomes friends in the spring of 1963 with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas area. And one of the first people who he takes to meet Oswald is this Colonel Orloff, who is a Unitarian.
Wow.
Right.
Wow,
So,
that's crazy.
It is crazy, right? So,
Wow.
I mean, that doesn't mean that there's a connection between these people and the assassination. But if Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union was a U.S. intelligence operation, it's very possible that all of these people are keeping an eye on Lee Harvey Oswald. And somehow, and Ruth Paine, and I mean, Paine's family had CIA connections, and her father did. I mean, it's just Michael Paine, her husband. His mother was best friends with Allen Dulles' mistress during World War II in Europe. I mean, it's just these connections just don't end. So anyway, so Oswald is about to defect to the Soviet Union. Doesn't have the money to get there, somehow does. He just seems to know where to go. Goes to France, has to go to England, goes to Sweden, what have you. But there is this woman, Priscilla Johnson, who was a World Federalist right after World War II. And World Federalists were basically people who thought the world would be better off if the United States and the Soviet Union could somehow mend fences and have learn to coexist and have a relationship. And she's also, there's another fellow, Cord Meyer, at the time, who becomes, he's also a World Federalist. He will become a CIA agent. He will become a suspect in the assassination of JFK. And his wife, Mary Pinchot Meyer, will become a mistress of JFK. And the year after the assassination, she will be killed jogging, just going along a canal park out in Georgetown section of Washington, D.C.
Right.
But so at this point, though, Priscilla Johnson and is a World Federalist, but she gets turned off by World Federalism, as does Cord Meyer. They're right now going in different directions, but they're the same path. And so she would tell writer John Newman, who did a great work on this, that
I just reached out to him last month, so I think I'm trying to set up an interview with him.
I think that would be great for you, because he has done some really great work, and he's really been. I've read all his books, and he's terrific. So anyway, so Priscilla tells John Newman that she comes back, and she's back and forth to Russia, right? She speaks Russian. That's what she wanted to do. And she, at some point in her life, she realized, she says, I grew up, meaning I realized what communism was all about. And Cord Meyer kind of had the same revelation. He thought that they could get along. He gets involved with the CIA, with student movements around the world, and he's going to bring everybody together. And he winds up that every time he tries to deal with the student groups from the Soviet Union, they're trying to screw the United States. So he breaks off from that. He becomes more of a right winger. So these people have a connection to the MIT Center for International Studies and the Russian Research Center out of Harvard that are involved in something called Project Troy. And the name itself, Project Troy, gives it makes you think of the Trojan horse and deception and what have you. So through these groups, there is at the time this CIA program of taking disgruntled Americans, ex-servicemen who are looking to defect behind the Iron Curtain. Oswald being one of them. The official list, they list Oswald as a tourist, which he was anything but. But so anyway, he does defect, and one of the people that interviews him immediately is Priscilla Johnson, and she's involved with everything there. So at the time of the U-2 flight, when it was shot down, the Russians dragged her in. They kind of set her up as an example. They humiliate her in front of the crowd. And when she comes back, by the way, when she will eventually, when she comes back to the United States, Stalin's daughter defects to the United States. She winds up staying in the home of Priscilla Johnson's parents while Priscilla is there, and Priscilla will then write her memoirs. Priscilla's husband, George Macmillan, happened to be a good friend of George de Morenscheit, the same George who was befriended Oswald and had that Unitarian Church connection. So there's so much going on with these people. And then after the assassination, when everyone was afraid that Marina Oswald was going to talk, she winds up befriending Priscilla Johnson, right? So now Priscilla is going to write her memoirs, and they hand her a big chunk of money. And you would think, if you're Priscilla Johnson, that you want this book out immediately, right? You've got Marina. The book came out 7 years after the assassination.
Wow. So they slow rolled it.
They did.
Oh,
They
wow.
did. They did. They waited until the pressure, and then it comes out as just a whitewash, right? So anyway, so Oswald winds up in Russia then, and I don't go in too much as far as his time in Russia. That's for the next book I'm working on right now. But here's the interesting thing about while he's there. There are these worries that it's not Oswald that's actually there, that he is an imposter. And believe it or not, it goes all the way up to the director of the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and the head of the passport office. Hoover, while he's there, Hoover sends a memo out to all of his agents that says, there's a possibility that this might be an imposter. So be on the lookout for when he comes back to the United States, that we vet him out properly to make sure he is.
It's incredible. So he's on the radar of Hoover before 63. So he
this is like 1959.
Right.
So now Dean Rusk is Secretary of State after John Kennedy becomes president, 1961, 62, in that range. He wants to come back home. And when Oswald was at the U.S. Embassy, he handed in his passport. And then he wound up in Minsk. So he wants to come back, and he's asking for his passport to be sent. Rusk tells the embassy, no, that there's a possibility that this man may be an imposter. You make sure you get his passport back, hand it to him in person, make sure he's the same guy. Okay, the passport office is doing the same thing. I mean, this is nobody. I mean, there are other defectors who were servicemen who left and went to the Soviet Union, came back. That this scrutiny was not, they were not subject to this. And now while he's there, that Francis Gary Powers U-2 flight gets shot down. Oswald is a radar operator who was tracking U-2 flights. The Russians know something's wrong with him. They suspect something. They don't utilize him for any propaganda purposes when he first defects, during the trial of Francis Gary Powers. In fact, they want to send him back immediately to the United States, and Oswald allegedly slashes his wrist, and so they decide to let him stay. But again, it's like they have a hot potato. They don't want him. So he comes back to the United States. But one thing that I noticed, okay, there's something that was going on with Lee Harvey Oswald while he's there. And when he left El Toro in California before defecting, he gets a Department of Defense ID card, and he gets his passport taken at the same time, selective service card. And if you look at the DOD card and the passport, and it is not the same person. They're taken about the same time. The hair is a little bit longer, this or that. Okay, fine. That could be, we could push that off as a just some kind of circumstance that you can't explain, but what have you. So he goes now to Russia, and he gets interviewed by, and he's 5'11" as he goes over to Russia. So he gets interviewed first by Aline Mosby, another reporter, who she writes a report and says he's 5'9", not 5'11". So immediately Priscilla Johnson's in there interviewing him, saying he's 5'11". Okay, the physical observations could be different, but in the meantime, all this imposter business is going on, right? So he comes back to the United States, and if he says he is 5'9". The only time he says he applies for jobs, 5'9", 5'9". Remember, he went over his 5'11". The only time he says he's 5'11" is when he applies for a new passport, and the height obviously has to match the original passport. You can't have the original passport say 5'11" and a new one say 5'9". So he says 5'11". So Oswald eventually, when he gets assassinated, at the autopsy, he's measured 5'9". And authorities, CIA, FBI, they all realize something's not right here. And they actually are pursuing, after the fact, the FBI and the CIA both are going, they're talking to the autopsy doctors later on. They're talking to the people at the funeral parlor, what have you. They're concerned. Why is this man 5'9" when the fellow who left the Marines is 5'11"? And there's all kinds of, now he has these Department of Defense cards he loses them twice. They get sent to the main office or to where in California where they were taken, and then they get sent to Oswald. How they know where he's living at the time, nobody knows. Now, they supposedly had taken photographs of Oswald when he was discharged, like they did for every Marine that was discharged. When they go to look for those, they're all gone. Okay, and there's something, in my opinion, part of the plan for Oswald, unrelated to the assassination, was they wanted to send him there and create the illusion that he was killed in Russia, came back to the United States, and he was almost like a sleeper agent that they could utilize for any kind of subversive operation against the Soviet Union if they wanted to. Maybe that was part of how he got sucked into the JFK assassination plot. I don't know, but I mean, there's more to it than that. But it's
just his whole life is really incredible. All the Watchers, all the people around, Kerry Thornley, all these characters, and just all these people, Clay Shaw, Sergio Archaka Smith.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, you had this whole network of people that were basically fighting Castro, but there was more to them. And Sergio Archaka Smith, believe it or not, we talked about Rose Jeremy earlier on, and the connection to George Hunter White, and she was thrown out of the car. Well, two of the guys that she was with at the bar that she pointed out, one of them was Sergio Archaka Smith, and so he was involved with the Cuban Revolutionary Council. These were people who were fighting Castro, and at the time there were two groups that after Castro came to power, who wanted to overthrow him. One was a right-wing group and one was a left-wing group. The left-wing group within CIA and the State Department wanted to replace Castro with a person who was also anti-Batista, who was Castro's predecessor in Cuba. The right-wing group wanted to replace Castro with a pro-Batista type right-wing Cuban. And this created internal conflicts within the CIA. And there was one person we should talk about is June Cobb, because June Cobb is such a mysterious person and was in the middle of all of the goings-on within Cuba. And her story begins in the 1950s, where she was engaged to some Colombian drug dealer. And so June is actually already operating as a informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and she winds up contracting allegedly malaria or whatever, and she goes back to Mount Sinai Hospital in the United States. She's there for 7 months in the hospital. While she's there, she somehow becomes friends with this guy, Warren Broglie, who was a CIA operative, who's like one of the head people running the Hilton Hotel in Manhattan, who winds up in Mexico City later on in a hotel there when Oswald winds up going there, and June Cobb does as well. But after 7 months at Mount Sinai, when she's done, she gets a job working at Mount Sinai. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm spending 7 months in a hospital, I don't want anything to do with that hospital. But Mount Sinai was connected with mind-altering drug experimentation on people. Okay, so it was, somehow maybe June Cobb's tied in with that. So anyway, so she winds up leaving there, but Castro comes to power, and he comes to New York. So she takes his manifesto of his story that he had written, and she was fluent in Spanish and English, and she translates it into English. She winds up somehow getting that to Castro. Now, she was a very attractive woman, and Castro meets with her, and she winds up going to Cuba and working as part of the Cuban government, but connected to the U.S. Embassy in Havana at a time when they're trying to overthrow the Castro regime, with names that like David Morales, David Atlee Phillips, Howard Hunt, Hunsinger, and a host of others, right? And mafia figures as well. And William Morgan is an American mercenary who had fought with Castro, and he and a Cuban named Gutierrez are in the Cuban military, but they're unhappy with Castro's turn to communism. They try and create this coup to overthrow Castro. It fails. So she winds up eventually coming back, June Cobb does, coming back to the United States, and in addition to being an informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, starts working for the CIA. And June infiltrates the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the same group that Oswald would join in 1963 and open a chapter in New Orleans. Okay, so that doesn't mean they're connected, right? I mean, maybe they're going in similar but divergent paths, but there's other things that seem to connect them. Now, June Cobb is originally from Norman, Oklahoma. And Norman was the site where they were doing drug experimentation on a lot of individuals, unsuspecting individuals. Well, a fellow named Thomas Eli Davis, he winds up having a connection to Norman. So does Lauren Hall. Now, these two guys, at the time of the assassination, are planning this invasion of Haiti, right around the time of JFK is going to get killed. Thomas Eli Davis winds up in Morocco getting arrested because he's got a letter on him with Oswald's name and something about the JFK assassination. It turns out that the Oswald they were talking about was not Lee Harvey Oswald, but this fellow named Victor Oswald in Madrid. There was this right-wing group in Madrid, international, including ex-communists and what have you. And this Victor Oswald has this letter or connection to this fellow Thomas Proctor, who's a CIA operative in New York, that's close to June Cobb, right? So this all kind of comes back and connects together. How is this all happening now? So Oswald, 2 months before he's going to, before JFK dies in September 1963, Oswald goes to Mexico City. Well, by this time, David Atlee Phillips is running the Mexico City office for the CIA, and June Cobb is there as well. And after the assassination, there is this famous poet. I can't think of her name now, but it slips me. It doesn't matter. She comes forward and tells people that she was at this party. Remember the Twist? This was at a time when Chubby Checker's Twist was, taking the world by storm. And she said there was a Twist party in Mexico City that Oswald was there. She was there. So she's living with her daughter and the sister, I believe, in Mexico City. Well, who winds up living in that same room with them after the assassination? June Cobb. Until they realize who June Cobb is, and they throw her out because they realize that she's up to no good. Now, one final word about June Cobb. She translated this book, The Shark and the Sardines, from Spanish into English. And what that was about, the shark was a metaphor for the United States. The sardines was a metaphor for Latin American countries. The shark swallowing up all of these countries and what they were doing. The last book Oswald took out of the library in Dallas was The Shark and the Sardines, which June Cobb had. translated into English. So the coincidences just seem to mount, and just much more than one would expect.
It's incredible. Her story is just another strange person around Oswald. I mean, do you think that Oswald was really in Mexico City?
I do.
Okay.
I do. You can make a case that it wasn't him, that it was an imposter. Now, I'm looking into that a little deeper right now, but part of me wonders if Oswald was trying to get out of the assassination, that he was part of it. I do think he was part of it. I think when he said he was a patsy, that he meant it. And, the word patsy in itself, right? I mean, if you were accused of a crime, I think, or if I was, I would say I didn't do it, what have you. I wouldn't call myself a patsy. That has a connotation of being set up. He did. And I think maybe he knew, like I said before, Richard Case Nagel fired a gun into a bank to get out of it.
Right.
Oswald, I think he did certain things. When he goes to Dallas weeks before the assassination, he drops an envelope off at the FBI office saying, "I'm threatening to blow up the FBI office." That should have been grounds to arrest this man. Okay, but I do think that was him in Mexico City. Yes, I do.
And there were other strange things too. We mentioned Bordentown.
Yeah.
But also was East Louisiana State Hospital. You say that's also a key element in understanding who Oswald was in your book.
It is.
And there's all kinds of strange things going on there too. Well, he's seen in a car with Ferry and Shaw at this hospital outside of Baton Rouge. Like, what's going on with that?
It is, right. It was in Clinton, Louisiana. And East Louisiana State Hospital was also known to have been doing drug experimentation on individuals, and one of their patients, by the way, was Rose Charmé, the same name that keeps popping up. So Oswald is going there with, like you say, Bannister and Shaw, and they parked for a longest time at just waiting, and they're noticed by people. And there was this voter registration drive going on. And at the time, obviously in the South, it's well known that these voter registration drives, especially to get African Americans to vote, there was a lot of resistance to that. And so they're watching this. So people were suspect about this long, black, basically stretched limo of these three white men sitting in it. And they took the license plate down, and it was connected to the International Trade Mart in Louisiana, in New Orleans, that was run by Clay Shaw. And so anyway, Oswald eventually winds up going to this applying for a job at this hospital, East Louisiana State Hospital. And he runs across a Dr. Silva. And the amazing thing about that is that Silva's cousin down in New Orleans winds up, his name is Bartz, B-A-R-T-E-S, or Bartis. When Oswald gets arrested, Bartis is there. When Oswald, he's like an informant for the FBI. He's kind of like, again, somebody keeping an eye on Oswald. There's just too many strange coincidences for a young man that should have been a nobody to always have these very important people surrounding him. And so what was going on there at this hospital, we don't really know. It's just Oswald had no business being there, certainly not with someone of Clay Shaw's stature. And David was David Ferry and Clay Shaw, excuse me, not Bannister. So Ferry again winds up, and you mentioned before about his hairless, this disease he had. That's how people described him. This guy was this funny looking guy. It's kind of hard to not say it's Ferry, because they said, he had no hair, and he would do crazy things like take grease and just put these fake eyebrows over his eyes. And so these names keep popping up. Now, what we don't know, and this is what I'm looking into now, is were they involved in the assassination, or were they set up to make it look like they were involved in the assassination? They were definitely connected with Oswald, and so there's a lot of rabbit holes that you go down as you try and break the assassination down itself. But all we do know is that you know, Ruby shot Oswald for a reason. And not to get ahead of ourselves and get into say the next volume, but and Ruby had connections to New Orleans, and Oswald had connections to New Orleans. Now, were they the ones responsible for the assassination? Possibly. Or is another group that was aware of this group in New Orleans that set them up? They also had connections to the mafia, Carlos Marcello, and what have you. So that's next volume. I'll bring that out and clarify.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Somebody said we should have a part 3. We're at about 60 minutes, Walter. Do you mind taking a few questions? Maybe you can answer these. I don't know. Have you identified the 3 tramps? I think GP Floor is asking you that.
Yeah, you know what? It's the 3 tramps. For me, I forget their names, but originally it was thought that maybe it was Frank Sturgis, Howard Hunt, and
Harrelson,
Charles Harrelson, right? For people who don't know, Woody Harrelson's father from Friends, and excuse me, from Cheers, and but it's kind of been discounted that these were just regular tramps and they were not, some kind of CIA operatives.
I think some people stated that was the Masonic symbol of the Jews, or JEWES, something Masonic, because I think they were walked into a Masonic hall too.
I didn't even know about that. So
I've heard that. I heard that from who was that? I can't remember. So I've done a lot of shows on JFK. I'm going to post another one. I did an interview with a guy about the Baron, this guy from the Netherlands came to Dallas and had a new DeMoor Sheldon talks about how crazy his life was.
Right.
Here's another one, Walter. Does the author think Fletcher Prouty?
He means Fletcher Prouty.
Fletcher Prouty, yeah.
Right.
Is he a good guy?
I think he is. I mean, some people, you know where Oliver Stone, that Mr. X in his movie, he patterned him after Fletcher Prouty, which I think then gave Fletcher Prouty a bad name. But Fletcher Prouty was a military man who was involved with the CIA during legitimate positions, and was in a position to keep to know a lot what was going on, whether it was the U-2 flights, what was going on in Cuba, and what have you. And he's a military guy who says there was a conspiracy, and some of his books are very interesting. And what's interesting about his books, or one fact that really I found enlightening, was how there was this interconnection of military men working for the CIA and vice versa. That it was, you'd think of them operating separately, and they were really united, a united front. And if you had, say, a right-wing element within CIA and within the military, they kind of crossed, and you could see where they came together. I don't think you have a domestic assassination plot against JFK, but having either the CIA or the Pentagon without them being connected and getting away with it. So I'm a supporter of Fletcher Prouty.
Yeah, and apparently Lansdale was like the military side, so he was the, not the CIA intel, but he was supposedly on site on November 22nd. And what do you think? Another whole Bible believer woman asks, what do you think of the allegations of Judith Very Baker, Oswald's so-called mistress?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't decided. I've never spoken with her, and I'd like to do that. In fact, I'm thinking of reaching out to her, and maybe we can have a discussion. She has some interesting information in that she has her pay records where she worked at that coffee, the Riley Coffee company in New Orleans, where Oswald worked. They worked there at the same time. Her background of being this was a biochemist, physicist, whatever she was, but she was in New Orleans to get on a scholarship to work for Ochner, right, the famous doctor who had his own right-wing connections, and then wound up working for Mary Sherman and claimed she was involved with that. Takes you in a whole different direction, and that's how she met Oswald. She claims she was Oswald's mistress. There's no proof of that. There's certain elements that she has that are connected. The story she tells fills in a lot of blanks. She does have some relations that she had while she was with Oswald in New Orleans, who have, I believe, signed affidavits saying that, yeah, they work together. But in my mind, the jury is still out on the authenticity of what she's saying.
Gotcha. And Whole Bible Believer, there's 2 volumes that we're covering the second volume.
Correct.
Really, there's a ton more information. We could definitely do another conversation about this book because there's so much more. And then Fire Pixie says, thanks for your opinion on Fletcher Prudy. Where is the best place, Walter, for people to get this book? 1 and 2, volume 1 and 2. It did not start with JFK.
Well, you can reach me out at my email at walter@herbstbooks.com, and herbstbooks.com is my website, and Facebook probably at Walter Herbst Author. You can get me there, and I'm on Twitter at Walter Herbst 3, and that would be I would say that's the 3 best places to get me.
Your last name is spelled
H-R, B as in boy, S like Sam, T like Thomas.
And your Twitter handle is Walter Herbst 3, right?
Correct. At Twitter, correct.
Great.
And reach out to me because I will reply. And there's a lot of people that have questions and a lot of unanswered questions. And I'm trying to. One of the purposes of me going back in time and starting in the 1920s to the 1960s was to just demonstrate that when 1960 came about, I think you reach the conclusion, if you read the books, that there was, you could make the case for an assassination, that, yeah, it could have happened. Too much thought is spent on looking at the assassination and saying, okay, we've got this group could have done it, this, that, and we don't believe it, it's impossible. But I think when you read these books, you say, you know what, it could have happened. And then we go on from there. And hopefully I can develop in the next book a convincing scenario to explain what really occurred.
Yeah, I mean, but the background is really the past is precedent leading up to November 22nd, 1963, because there's a lot of pieces there. But Oswald himself, you can do a whole book on Oswald, just how mysterious he was.
Yes.
At the age of and dead at 24, the whole story. I actually saw a documentary online where they disinterred his body and said it wasn't him. Like, so there's just, yeah. Have you heard that story?
Well, there's actually a guy named Eddowes who wrote a book in like the 70s who represented Marina Oswald, and he thought that it was an imposter. Wow. But he thought that he was killed in Russia, that a Russian agent came over and killed JFK. And they did, Marina had to sign off on it, and they did get approval to take the casket up. But the interesting thing, when they took up the casket, they found it had already been tampered with. Like the lid was half off, cement was broken, and they found through dental records that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, you would think with what's at these people's disposal is they could have altered dental records to make it match either his in the casket or just the dental records that they had on file, which is probably the case. It's just I cover it in a book to a certain extent, but what the FBI and CIA, the extent they went to try and prove it was Oswald or disprove it, asking, he had those, I mentioned before about his attempted suicide when he was in Russia, asking doctors in the autopsy, were there scars on the left wrist? He had an adenoid operation. Were there scars there? So there's more to this man than just some disgruntled ex-Marine who says he was a communist or represented himself as a communist than that. Well,
your 2 books, I got to commend you because you've done excellent research, and I learned so much just reading some of the introductory chapters. So I definitely highly recommend people check out these 2 books. They're very, very well worth your time.
I appreciate that.
Really great to talk with you, Walter. So
my pleasure.
Appreciate it. All right, take care. Have a good weekend.
Thanks. You too.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Stay there.